We have a problem as modern church musicians, and that is that when I say church music, you know what I'm talking about. Let me explain. Worship has become a genre of music. If you look at the CCLI Top 100 songs, it's dominated by Elevation and Brandon Lake and Phil Wickham, and of course there's the other names like Bethel and Maverick City and Cody Carnes. But the point is, there's between 3 and 6 people that are really dominating all of church music across America, according to CCLI statistics, which covers a lot of American churches. Now, all of these artists have their own kind of unique spin on things, but at its core, they all have a very similar instrumental structure. Tonic pad bass, a lead or a power line on electric guitar or keys or both, either a piano or an acoustic or both, keeping the main rhythm, and then one vocalist starts and the others come in as the song progresses. And then from a structural standpoint, you have what I would consider the modern worship song formula. You have a big opening, then you have a lower verse, and maybe a lighter chorus, before you build into the next verse and some bigger choruses, the bridges drop all the way down, build all the way through, and then carry you out of the song. This is how so many worship songs go. And this is true for a whole lot of those songs on the CCLI Top 100. And this is because worship has become a product, an industry. It's become so produced that all of these bands are really dominating all of the music that we sing. And don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem with these specific bands or some of the music that they write. But the reality is, bands like Elevation and Bethel and Hillsong have become very little more than worship song mills, as a friend of mine put it. These bands and artists are in album release cycles now, and they have been for years, so they're writing because they need to write. It's not only something that they do for worship, but it's also their livelihood. They make money this way, they tour this way. And so they write a lot because they have to write a lot. They need to feed the music industry, and they need to feed themselves with the money that they make from it. I get it. It's the reality of doing music for your job. But when you write because you have to, it results in shallower, less well thought out music. We end up with albums worth of worship music that are 12 songs long, and 10 of them are shallow and uninteresting, and you get 2 really good songs on the album. You'll get a couple songs that are theologically rich and musically interesting, and you'll get a bunch of other stuff that is there to fill an album. Because the reality is that writing because you have to produces less quality and inspired music than writing out of passion because you want to. And writing because you just need to fill an album makes you end up with songs that just aren't really worth singing in church, or at least songs that don't really need to exist given better written alternatives. I think of the song Available by Elevation Worship. I hate this song. It is not lyrically interesting, it's extremely repetitive, and I think there are other songs that say what it says better. For example, the song Send Me by Bethel. It still takes this idea of, I am a servant here for God to use me, right? But it says this in a more lyrically rich way, and a more musically interesting way as well. And maybe this is just a case where one team of writers did a better job than the other team of writers when it came to writing a song about this subject. But I would hedge a guess that Available was probably one of those songs that was written to fill an album, and Send Me was written very intentionally. And while I can't guarantee that, that was a song that Bethel wrote because, they really wanted to write this song, it wasn't something that they were just writing to write, I think the point still stands that sometimes they're writing because they have to, and it leads to a poorer product. But this idea that writing because you want to produces better music than writing because you have to is true even outside of worship. Sitting down and writing something because I feel the need to write something produces a much worse song than if I have something to say and a reason to say it. This is true all over the music industry, inside and outside of worship. The reality is, writing worship music out of obligation produces lower quality worship songs and is not giving God the best that we can give him. Especially when you consider that worship isn't about just the music. Worship isn't this genre of music that we've created as modern praise and worship. It's us responding to God. So how can we fix this? Worship has become this very defined genre, and that expands even outside of the church. People refer to praise and worship music as its own sound. So how can we fix this? Because worship shouldn't be confined to a genre. Worship is a conversation we're having with God. It's something that we're doing to interact with him and with each other as the body of Christ. So how can we fix it? I've talked a lot about learning your parts and knowing the song, and those are good things to do. Learn the song really well so that you know it and are able to play it. But don't lock into the part that was on the recording. Let yourself be a musician. Copying is a really good skill to have, but be creative. Creativity in worship is an awesome thing to see, and we need more of it. Sure, the guy who did the guitar work for a song may have written some really cool lead lines, but who's to say that he wrote the best one, or that you can't, do something a little different, a little more interesting, do something that makes it your own and the church's own, to infuse the worship songs with more authenticity. God created us to be creative, so why would we use all of that creative energy and instead of channeling that, copy someone else's creative energy? We're not just a cover band. We also need to think more deeply as worship leaders and worship musicians. The reality is that worship music requires more thought and intentionality than other music because of the purpose that it serves. We are leading a congregation in a time to commune with God, to talk to God as the body of Christ. And because of that, we have to put more thought and more energy into understanding the songs that we're singing and choosing the songs that we're singing and writing the songs that we're singing in church. This isn't a concert where we're just trying to put on a good show and have a good time with the people in the audience. This is worshiping the God that created us. We have a responsibility as worship leaders and worship musicians to give the best that we can give in our worship music. So we have to think more deeply about it. And I've alluded to this already, but be creative. Don't be afraid to change the instrumentation. You don't need to sound just like the band who recorded it, because you're not that band. You don't need to sound exactly like Bethel. You're not playing in an elevation cover band. You're worshiping God with people around you. And this is a really awesome way to allow worship musicians to be more creative in their worship and use these skills that God has given them in unique ways. You even have bands like Elevation doing things like this, creating the Carolina version of Praise, which I think is arguably a more interesting version of the song than the original recording of it. And going from there, ditch the tracks. If you want to hear me talk a little more in depth about tracks, you can go check out the newest episode of the Sound Doctrine podcast. I'll leave a link in the description below, so you can go check that out. Had a really good time having a good conversation with those guys, but you can check that out down below. But in my opinion, you can ditch the tracks. You don't need them. Even if you only have a couple of musicians, even if it's just you and one other person, you don't need those tracks. Realistically, the only purpose that those serve is to make your band sound more like the recorded version of the song. And the point of worship is not to replicate someone else's music, it's to worship. And sure, there's nothing wrong with playing the lead lines or some of the cool parts from the original recording of the song, but there's no reason to play it exactly like it was recorded. So why would you bother using tracks that do nothing but make it sound like the recording? Sounding like a recording isn't the goal. Worshiping God is the goal. So why are we using things like tracks to push our bands to sound just like the recording? It's unnecessary. There is value in authenticity and worship, in us giving our full selves to God in that moment, not giving ourselves to sounding like a recording. Tracks restrict creativity even more because you don't really have the option of going anywhere else in the song. You have to play straight through it, or at the very least, straight through the roadmap that you pre-assigned at the beginning of the song. If you get off by a beat, it's going to cause even more problems because now you have instruments that are off track of other instruments. But most importantly to me, they enable your musicians to be lazy. If you want your musicians to be the best that they can be and to practice as much as you want them to practice, stop using the tracks. They feel like they can hide. Or, there's even a possibility that people will just not want to play on team anymore because they think, oh, I can be replaced by that. I had a friend who was a bass player who, the synth bass tracks would be left on, and he would be like, well, why am I even here? I don't need to be here because there's synth bass covering the ground that I'm covering. You don't need the tracks. If you don't have a lot of musicians, you're better off doing something like an acoustic set where it's just you and another person. I've done this plenty of times where it's just me and another worship leader, and we have an acoustic guitar and a cajon, and we go for it. And those are some of the best worship sets that I've ever played in my life. Not just because of simple instrumentation, but because we've brought it all back to a core. We're not trying to put on this whole production. It's just us playing our instrument and singing and leading people in worship. We just let ourselves be musical. And a lot of times when we do that, we won't even use a click, and that's awesome. Although I do see a lot of value in click in working with volunteer musicians. I think that's a really good thing for keeping people together. But the tracks, get them out of here. You don't need them. Another thing is you don't always have to play simple. Simplicity is over-glorified in worship music. Most worship songs, if they have more than 4 or 5 chords, people kind of start to freak out a little bit, and I think that's ridiculous. I understand that you're working with volunteer musicians, but volunteer musicians can still practice and can still learn songs that are more interesting than G, E minor, C, and D. And just because the music isn't about you, it's about worshiping God, it doesn't mean you can't make interesting, quality music. So don't be afraid to be musical. You don't have to just play completely laid back. Of course, there are times that call for some simplicity, and there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with simplicity at all. But I think a lot of times in worship, we over-glorify this idea of playing simple or being simple in our music playing, and that's not necessary. And finally, we need to write new worship music. I'm not saying throw away all the worship music that's been written or not to use any of the new worship music that's being written by even these big bands. But I'm saying that as worship leaders, we have a responsibility to write music for our people. A lot of people write worship music even just for their own churches. The song How He Loves was written by John Mark McMillan for his own church before it blew up because people heard the song and absolutely loved it, and then Crowder recorded it, and then it's become hugely popular and controversial for that one lyric. But worship leaders are writing these songs for their own congregations. Look at what your congregation needs, what your congregation is feeling and going through. Write music for that. I'm not saying you need to write every song that you sing in your church, but write theologically rich, interesting music for worship. And it doesn't have to just sound like everyone else. Make something unique. Don't try to fit into this box that we've created for worship music, for praise and worship music. Write something that is theologically rich and communicates a message of God. And don't write just to write. Write when there is something to say, when there is a need to be met musically. Don't just sit there and write because you feel like you're obligated to write worship music. That's realistically a big part of what's ruining worship music overall. The fact that we've created an industry out of it and people are using worship writing as their livelihood has made it so that sometimes they have to do it. Not everyone wants to do their job all the time, even if they like it. And so this industry that we've created makes it so that they have to write. And we end up with just a bunch of music that's not worth singing. Now, I want to get something straight. I'm not saying you shouldn't write music that sounds like that or that you shouldn't play music that sounds like that. I really enjoy the sound of praise and worship music. My favorite worship song of the last couple of years, Trust in God, was written by Elevation. The problem is that when I say praise and worship music, you immediately have an idea of what that sounds like in your head. But the reality is, worship isn't a genre. Worship is a conversation with God. Metal can be worship music. Rap can be worship music. Folk can be worship music. In fact, I really love some good folk worship music. It sounds awesome. You don't need to go into your church on Sundays with the intention of sounding like these recorded worship bands that already exist. And part of this can happen by expanding your own knowledge base of worship bands. Intentionally seek out worship music that is different, that isn't the same as everything else that you're playing. Because worship isn't supposed to just be about the music. And we've created an industry that has made it just about this one musical genre that we've created. So I'm not saying to stop singing this music. I am saying to stop singing some of it. Critically think about the songs that you have in your canon right now or that you're hearing on the radio and think, what is this truly saying? And are there other worship songs that say this in a more articulate way? And if there's not, maybe write something better yourself. Talk with others, get more opinions. Don't just rely only on yourself and your own thoughts to select these worship songs. But as worship leaders and worship musicians, we have a responsibility to hold ourselves to a higher standard when it comes to the music that we're making. And right now, looking at how many churches are starting to use things like tracks and how so many churches are just trying to get that worship sound that's in the recording, I don't really feel like we're doing that as worship leaders and worship musicians. We're essentially turning our worship teams into cover bands, and that's not what worship bands are for. So to kind of wrap up and summarize everything, there is more than one genre for worship music. Find your church's sound. Change up your sound once in a while. Let your musicians be creative and be the good musicians that they are. Don't make them just copy other parts and then play to a track. It's not authentic. That's not good musicianship. That's just copying what everyone else is doing. It sucks the life and soul out of the worship music. Worship is more than a Nord, stacked drives, and a rhythmic acoustic guitar. God already has an Elevation. He already has a Brandon Lake. He already has a Bethel. He doesn't need more of the same thing. Be your own worship musicians and stop just sticking to this produced, industrialized genre that we've created and called worship. Sound different, write different, and make your own worship sound. Thank you so much for listening to me talk about this for this long. Let me know down in the comments your thoughts on this subject, and if you have any differing opinions or similar opinions at all. This is something that I'm very passionate about. I think we've made worship really boring, especially in the last 20 to 25 years, and I think we need to change that. Worship music doesn't just need to be simple, boring stuff. But anyway, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. It would mean a lot to me if you would like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Later.